Dang it, I can't finish this lecture. Someone just had to call me on the telephone who I think was a telemarketer to ruin that video, too. Uh, where was I going? In the midst of that, you had what they called the Jesus movement, was actually one of the largest explosions of personal conversions in the history of the American church. There were some. So a lot of people and there was in particular, there's a really interesting subculture of people called Jesus freaks that got saved out of the hippie life and kind of kept doing it, but without all the sex and drugs aspects of it. But there's there was a reaction. A lot of people, like Jenny and Forrest Gump, started to realize that this whole way of doing life was ultimately not as satisfying as actually having some stability in a home and stuff like that. So a lot of the hippies did kind of settle down, kind of move into the mainstream over the course of the 1970s. And one of the things that's going to be unique about the 70s is a lot of this stuff that happened, because if you actually went back in time to the 1960s, you'd see it was really a pretty straight-laced conservative time. The counterculture stuff is really happening in certain pockets. It's kind of a hip scene away from the vast majority of people in the 1960s were still living in a way that Leave It to Beaver would make sense on TV. They could relate to that and be like, oh yeah, that's kind of my house, more or less. So the 70s is really the time period where what had been kind of an underground current in the 60s really starts to influence mainstream society, because a lot of these cultural changes kind of wound up taking time. And ultimately, the counterculture, while it was counterproductive, it was one of the most important moments in American history, and had a big impact on the mainstream in the following decades. And it also has a lot to do, as we'll see, with the end of the Vietnam War, because even though a lot of average Americans would not have supported the anti-war movement or the people behind it, and would have been upset at things they did, like burning their draft cards in the street, and some of them would even burn American flags and stuff like that. And the average American was not going to be down with that. But at the same time, they kind of got the ball rolling on opposition to the war, and it started to hit the mainstream after the Tet Offensive and things like that. So, anyway, we will. So let me say, I should probably go through 68 election here real quick. So, all this leads to a pretty tense situation in the 1968 election. Lyndon Johnson, seeing his popularity fall, decides not to run for re-election, even though he could have served one more term, because he didn't serve a full half of Kennedy's term. And so an early Democratic primary is won by a peace candidate named Eugene McCarthy. He wants to get out of Vietnam. McCarthy didn't really have a chance of winning the election, but it was a sign to Johnson that he stood a chance of not being renominated. And he didn't want to run any risk of that embarrassment. So Johnson just announces his retirement, says he's not going to seek his a potential second full term, third term altogether. So that leaves the Democratic field wide open. The Republicans are going to wind up picking Richard Nixon, who had been Eisenhower's vice president and a congressman from California before that. The Democrats look like they're going to go into the direction of Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's brother and former Attorney General, who is also running on an anti-Vietnam platform, which was a little bit of a change from RFK of when he was in power with his brother, was a diehard Cold Warrior, so he had kind of changed his tune on Vietnam a little bit. So RFK was running against the war. He gets assassinated by a Palestinian nationalist named Sirhan Sirhan, who is upset at their support for Israel. And this happens right around within a very short period of time from a white supremacist named James Earl Ray assassinating Martin Luther King Jr. At the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was in town to speak into a strike relating to some workers in the city. So the atmosphere is very tense in '68 between MLK dying and RFK dying and all this stuff. Ultimately, the Democrats wind up picking a very unpopular choice, Johnson's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, who was going to continue the Vietnam War as was. What happens in '68 at the Democratic National Convention, the anti-war protesters take to the streets against Johnson, against the Vietnam War, and against Humphrey. Was kind of shoehorned into the nomination by the party bosses. He did not really do well in primaries, which at the time were not binding. They were just kind of formal polling. Mayor Daley, the mayor of Chicago, brings out the National Guard, and they start cracking heads, just start whipping hippies left and right, using very strong arm tactics. And it's riots in the streets. People are getting beat up. Protesters are attacking things. It was a mess. And this kind of horrifies Middle America. So '68, Nixon really starts running on a platform of law and order, basically trying to paint the Democrats as they're the party of everybody that's rioting in the streets, and I'm the guy that's going to kind of put society back together the way it was a few years ago. And Nixon was not a segregationist, although he would have moved probably a little slower on some civil rights things than Johnson had. But he is going to appeal to people who were both upset about. He's going to walk kind of a moderate line on the segregation front. He's going to really appeal to people that are, in general, didn't recognize the world anymore from where it was 5 years ago. And so ultimately, he's going to run this kind of law and order oriented campaign. The Southern Democrats, a lot of them revolted and went with the independent candidacy of George Wallace. So George Wallace was the Democratic governor of Alabama. Basically, he or his wife were the governor of Alabama for a number of decades. And he was probably the most famous segregationist politician in America. Continually stood up. He gave this one famous speech where he said, "Segregation now, segregation forever." Had at one point had stood in the door of a school that was trying to integrate, and similar to what Orville Faubus had done. Wallace runs as a third party on kind of on segregation and kind of a New Deal era economic liberalism with a little more aspects of some social conservatism. Wallace wins 5 southern states. He's the last third-party candidate to actually win electoral votes. And then what's interesting about this election is that Nixon sweeps the rest of the South. For the first time since the Democrats became a thing, the Democrats didn't win a single southern state. As of 1964, they were considered part of the solid South going back 100 years. But the increasing prevalence of the left-wing faction of the Democratic Party, combined with some discontent over segregation and some other things, led to a realignment where most of the southern states started to drift slowly into the Republican camp. They started to drift into Republican presidential politics sooner than they did congressional politics. There were still Democratic congressional majorities in the South until the early 90s, until 1994. But they start to move in a more Republican direction in the presidential races, starting with Nixon in '68. Ultimately, Nixon is going to win a pretty decisive majority over Humphrey. And the Nixon presidency, while Nixon actually, we'll talk about him more in the next video, actually turns out to be fairly liberal certainly on economic matters. His election kind of represented a counter reaction to a lot of the countercultural stuff, and some of the violence in the streets and the general air of uncertainty that was going on in the country at that time. So anyway, we'll come back next week and we'll take a look at the 70s and 80s.